Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition faces increasing condemnation for airstrikes the UN says are responsible for the majority of civilian deaths in Yemen's ongoing conflict. Nearly 6,000 people have died and at least 70 health clinics have been bombed since the Saudi-led bombing began in March. Speaking at the UN Security Council, UN Human Rights Chief Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein said a disproportionate amount of attacks on civilians are carried out by the U.S.-backed Saudi coalition.
I have observed with extreme concern the continuation of heavy shelling from the ground and the air in areas with a high concentration of civilians, as well as the perpetuation of the destruction of civilian infrastructure, in particular hospitals and schools, by all parties to the conflict, although a disproportionate amount appeared to be the result of airstrikes carried out by coalition forces. U.S.
Ambassador Samantha Power to the Security Council. The Obama administration has urged the Saudis to abide by international law, but the U.S. continues to back the airstrikes with intelligence and weapons, including a billion-dollar deal to restock Saudi Arabia's Air Force arsenal, which is depleted by its bombing campaign in Yemen. The sale included thousands of air-to-ground munitions and so-called general-purpose bombs. The United States has also reportedly sold internationally banned cluster munitions to Saudi Arabia, now being used in Yemen. This comes as a new report by the UN, and the International Office of Migration says more than 2.5 million people are internally displaced inside Yemen. Meanwhile, also in Yemen, tribal sources say a U.S. drone strike killed 4 people in the central Nata district on Tuesday. This comes as Somali government officials say a suspected U.S. drone strike hit al-Shabaab training camps in the lower Shabelle region overnight on Tuesday. The number of casualties has not been reported. In Afghanistan, British soldiers have been deployed to Helmand province amidst fighting between Afghan government soldiers and Taliban forces in the city of Sangin. The British troops join U.S. Special Operations soldiers who were sent to Helmand weeks ago. Meanwhile, new details about Monday's deadly suicide bombing near the Bagram air base show that one of the 6 U.S. soldiers killed was Major Adriana Vorgerbruggen, one of the first openly gay female service members in combat. She'd spent years working to repeal the U.S. military's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy and died one day before the 5th anniversary of its repeal. In Britain, U.S. authorities have sparked outrage by barring a British Muslim family headed to Disneyland for vacation from boarding their flight to Los Angeles. The family of 11 had already been granted travel authorization. Family members say they were given no explanation for why they were turned away from the plane at London's Gatwick Airport. The airline says they will not be refunded the more than $13,000 cost of their flights. Another British Muslim traveler, imam and lecturer Ajmal Mansour, was also turned away from his U.S.-bound flight 2 days later. In Denver, Colorado, Clarence Moses L has been released from prison after serving 28 years for a crime he has always maintained he did not commit. In 1989, Clarence Moses L, who's African-American, was sentenced to 48 years in prison after a woman said she dreamed he was the man who raped and beat her in the dark. The victim was raped and badly beaten in her apartment. Initially, she named 3 men she'd been drinking with that night as her possible attackers. None of them was Clarence Moses L. But police never investigated those men because a day and a half later, the victim said she had a dream that Moses L was the one who raped her. The police would later throw out the rape kit and any possible evidence like bed sheets and her clothes. This summer, one of those 3 men she originally named confessed. On Tuesday afternoon, Moses L was released to a crowd that included his wife, his son, and several of his 12 grandchildren, whom he'd never met, as he did not want them to see him in prison. Clarence Moses L's retrial is set for next June. To see our interview with Moses L's lawyer and the editor of the Colorado Independent, you can go to democracynow.org. In Chicago, the family of Sandra Bland has called for criminal charges against Texas State Trooper Brian Encinia, who violently arrested the 28-year-old African-American woman after accusing her of failing to signal a lane change on July 10th. Bland was found dead in a Waller County jail cell 3 days later. Her family and supporters have disputed authorities' claim her death was a suicide. Dashcam footage from the arrest shows Encinia forcibly removing Bland from her car and threatening to light her up. The family's call for criminal charges comes one day after a grand jury said it would not issue any indictments in connection with Bland's death inside the jail cell. Although the prison officers won't face charges, Officer Encinia could still be indicted when the grand jury reconvenes next month. We'll have more on the case with Sandra Bland's family and their lawyer after headlines. Meanwhile, in New York, public records show the police officer who shot and killed unarmed teenager Ramarley Graham has received nearly $25,000 in raises since firing the fatal shot almost 4 years ago. Ramarley Graham was an 18-year-old African-American teenager. He was unarmed when Officer Richard Haste shot him dead inside the bathroom of his grandmother's home. Haste was initially charged with manslaughter, but a judge later threw out the indictment on procedural grounds. A second grand jury elected not to indict. Officer Haste has been on desk duty since killing Graham. A federal investigation into possible civil rights violations in the case is ongoing. Army Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl, who spent 5 years in Taliban captivity, has been arraigned on charges related to his disappearance from a U.S. base in Afghanistan in 2009. Bergdahl was released by the Taliban last year in exchange for 5 Guantanamo prisoners. He said he walked off his post in an attempt to reach another U.S. base and report wrongdoing in his unit. The Army officer who investigated his case testified against any prison time and recommended Bergdahl go before a special court-martial, where his maximum possible punishment would be a year behind bars. But he has instead been ordered to a general court-martial where he faces a possible life sentence if convicted. In Colombia, President Juan Manuel Santos has signed a measure legalizing and regulating medical marijuana in the latest move by a Latin American country to reverse course on the U.S.-backed war on drugs. Uruguay legalized marijuana in 2013, and medical marijuana legalization bills are being considered in Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, and Mexico. Meanwhile, in Ecuador, operations have begun at the billion-dollar Chinese-owned Mirador open-pit copper mine. It's the first large-scale copper mine in Ecuador. The mine has faced massive resistance by the indigenous Shuar people, who say they were not consulted and have been forced off their lands by its construction. In November 2014, leading anti-mining activist José Isidro Tendenza Antun was found dead only days before he was due to speak out against the Mirador mine at the UN Climate Summit in Lima, Peru. He was found buried with his arms and legs bound and with signs of torture. Activists have accused the Ecuadorian authorities of complicity in his murder. Speaking a year before his death at the Assembly of the Communities of the South of Ecuador in December 2013, Tendenza urged the community to stay united against threats to their ancestral territory.
Compañeros, here, united, we have to continue forward. Compañeros, if we are not united, we don't have value. Compañeros, now is the time. Now is the time to say enough to this corruption that comes to us and the threats to our territory in the Ecuadorian Amazon.
That was the late Ecuadorian anti-mining activist José Isidro Tendenza Antun speaking in December 2013, nearly a year before he was murdered. The Israeli ambassador to the U.S. has announced that all holiday gifts from the embassy this year will be deliberately sourced from settlements in the occupied territories in an effort to counter the global boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign. In a major victory for the BDS campaign, the European Union recently announced some goods produced in Israeli-occupied land must be labeled, quote, made in settlements. The top editor of the Las Vegas Review-Journal has resigned, less than 2 weeks after billionaire major Republican Party donor Sheldon Adelson secretively bought the newspaper for $140 million. Editor Michael Hengel resigned days after the Review Journal published an article indirectly critical of its new owners. Review Journal columnist Norm Clark reacted to the resignation, tweeting, quote, "I've never used the word noble before, but then I've never worked for someone as noble and ethical as Mike Hengel." In news from the campaign trail, fundraising sources for Hillary Clinton say they believe Bernie Sanders has raised more money during the fourth quarter of this year than the Clinton campaign. This comes only days after Sanders' campaign announced it's received 2 million individual campaign contributions, putting it on pace to break President Obama's record. Meanwhile, Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump has continued to spark outrage and concern over his language. Speaking at a campaign rally in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Trump repeatedly said he hates journalists, but that he wouldn't kill them. This clip begins with Trump referring to Russian President Vladimir Putin.
And then they said, you know, he's killed reporters. And I don't like that. I'm totally against that. By the way, I hate some of these people, but I'd never kill them. I hate them. No, these people... Honestly, I'll be honest. I would never kill them. I would never do that. Let's see. No, I wouldn't. I would never kill them. But I do hate them.
At the same campaign rally, Donald Trump sparked criticism with continued sexist comments about rival candidate Hillary Clinton. First, he began talking about Hillary Clinton's bathroom break during Saturday's Democratic presidential debate, saying, quote, "What happened to her? I know where she went. It's disgusting. I don't want to talk about it. No, it's too disgusting. Don't say it. It's disgusting," he said. Then he began talking about Hillary Clinton's loss to President Obama during the 2008 presidential race, saying, quote, "She was favored to win, and she got schlonged. She lost." Schlong is the Yiddish word for penis. In response, Jennifer Palmieri, the communications manager for Clinton's campaign, tweeted, quote, "We're not responding to Trump, but everyone who understands the humiliation this degrading language inflicts on all women should." And candidate Hillary Clinton sparked criticism of her own on Tuesday after her campaign website posted a list of, quote, 7 ways Hillary Clinton is just like your abuela. Thousands of Latinos quickly took to Twitter to list the ways Hillary Clinton was not just like their grandmother. Both the hashtags not mi abuela and not my abuela quickly went viral as people denounced what they saw as, quote, Hispandering by the Clinton campaign, as they put it. Many drew attention to the funding Clinton's campaign received from private prison corporations with government contracts to run for-profit detention centers for undocumented immigrants. Others drew attention to Clinton's statements on CNN last year calling for the U.S. to send back children fleeing violence in Central America who've reached the U.S. border.
Should they be able to stay here? It's safer.
It may be safer, but that's not the answer. I do not.
So should they be sent back?
Well, first of all, we have to provide the best emergency care we can provide. We have children 5 and 6 years old who have come up from Central America. We need to do more to provide border security in southern Mexico.
They should be sent back now?
Well, they should be sent back as soon as it can be determined who responsible adults and their families are.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Hi, I'm Amy Goodman. I want to thank you for tuning in to Democracy Now! We are so grateful to our fans and followers for being a part of the daily conversation. By choosing a news source that's committed to the truth, you're carrying the message of independent media, reaching hundreds of thousands of people every day. In these times of war and elections, we need a media not sponsored by corporations that profit from war, but a media that's truly independent, funded by you. Democracy Now! Is not paid for by the weapons manufacturers, the insurance industry, or the oil, gas, coal, or nuclear companies. We don't take advertising or corporate underwriting dollars. That means we rely on your donations to make our daily independent news hour possible. We need your support today to keep bringing you the hard-hitting, in-depth reporting you've come to expect 5 days a week. Visit democracynow.org, or you can call 888-999-3877. That's 888-999-3877 to make your holiday gift to Democracy Now! Today. Thanks so much for sharing Democracy Now! Stories all year long.